Number 12. Mariam Sakotis. Known to her followers as Mariam of Keratia, Mariam Sakotis became a Greek Orthodox nun during the early 20th century at the age of 23. She followed a monk named Father Matthew Karpathikis, who branched off from the traditional Old Calendarist sect of the church to form a new faction called the New Calendarists. Sakotis was a founding member of a monastery that Karpathikis established in 1927. She played a key role in acquiring property for the hermitage, and it remains unclear to this day how she got her hands on the money she used to pay for the land. The nun eventually became the monastery's abbess, a role she had essentially been fulfilling for over a decade before receiving the official title. She took over the day-to-day operations for Karpathikis, who was aging and dedicated to his religious activities, and continued to fill the leadership role following his death. After becoming the abbess, Sakotis resorted to disturbing fundraising techniques. Her typical MO involved persuading wealthy women to join the convent and then torturing them until they gave her their money. She also sent monks out in search of rich widows and single women to steal from. In many cases, she killed a victim after getting her hands on their fortune. Police began investigating Sakotis during the late 1940s after receiving a tip from the daughter of one of the victims, who had deeded all her properties over to the monastery. Knowing her mother would not have willingly given up her land, the daughter implored the authorities to dig deeper and find out what was really going on at the shady establishment. In 1949, American authorities turned their attention towards Sakotis, who was suspected of foul play in connection with the disappearance of an 18-year-old woman from Toledo, Ohio, named Samela Spirides. The FBI had tracked Spirides to the monastery, where the victim's father claimed the young woman had been lured by Sakotis. In addition to the outright murders the crooked nun committed, she was accused of causing at least 150 unnecessary deaths by subjecting her followers to dangerously strict ascetic practices. And according to authorities, Sakotis prevented doctors from providing medical treatment to followers who were suffering from tuberculosis and instead only allowed them to sign death certificates. During a late-night raid of the compound in December 1950, police freed dozens of emaciated elderly women from a basement where they were found tied up, half-clothed and sick. Sakotis and 13 other monks and nuns were charged with a litany of crimes, including homicide, fraud, forgery of wills, torture, and blackmail, with Sakotis receiving the harshest charges. She was convicted of 7 murders before her death, but was suspected of committing several more that never saw their day in court. The disgraced nun maintained her innocence from behind bars, where she died in 1954 while serving a 14-year sentence. Number 11. Wana Bara. Nobody knows exactly when Wana Bara Samperio began killing or how many people she killed. Nicknamed La Mataviahitas, or the Little Old Lady Killer, she claimed at least 16 victims, all elderly women over the age of 60, in and around Mexico City between the late 90s and 2006. Police believe there were other victims, with some estimating that Bara may have killed as many as 48 people. Before she became a serial killer, Bara was a mother of 4 and a professional wrestler. Going by the stage name La Dama del Silencio, or the Lady of Silence, she specialized in a form of masked Mexican wrestling known as lucha libre. The murders went on for years without any general consensus among police regarding whether they were all the work of one serial killer, 2 killers, or more. Investigators were also misled by at least one red herring after noticing that 3 of Barathe's victims owned a copy of an 18th century painting by French artist Jean-Baptiste Greuze called Boy in a Red Waistcoat. This was merely a coincidence, but law enforcement mistakenly suspected that the painting somehow represented a connection between the victims. Bara was finally arrested in 2006 after she was caught fleeing the home of 82-year-old Ana Maria de los Reyes Alfaro, who she had just finished strangling to death with a stethoscope. Many people, including members of law enforcement, were shocked to learn that the 48-year-old serial slayer was a woman, even though witness descriptions had accurately indicated that the suspected killer may have been a woman with masculine features. One of the more accurate predictions made by law enforcement was that Baratha gained access to her victims by knocking on their doors and pretending to be a government official or public servant of some kind. Posing as a social worker or a nurse, she offered medical and other services to her victims, which earned their trust and gave her easy access to their homes. Once she got inside, she strangled her victims to death using pantyhose, rope, or whatever was lying around. Baratha admitted to 3 murders but was convicted of 16 killings and sentenced to 759 years in prison. She told law enforcement that she was motivated to kill by lingering resentment toward her abusive mother, stemming from her childhood. Authorities surmised that she was a remorseless psychopath, which was most likely true, all things considered. The full scope of her crimes may never be known. Number 10. Bradley Robert Edwards. 2 young Australian women were murdered and another disappeared in 1996 and 1997 in what became known as the Claremont serial killings. All 3 women vanished under similar circumstances after visiting nightclubs in the Perth suburb of Claremont, which was why police believed one person was behind the crimes. The first victim, 18-year-old Sarah Spears, vanished in January 1996 after leaving a club at around 2 a.m. She remains missing to this day, but is presumed dead. 6 months later, in June of 1996, 23-year-old Jane Rimmer disappeared in the same area after a night out with friends. Her naked body was found about 2 months later in the bushland, roughly 25 miles from where she went missing. The third victim, a 27-year-old attorney named Ciara Glennon, vanished in March of 1997. Like the 2 previous women, she was on her way home after a night out on the town. Her murdered remains were found 19 days later in the wilderness, much like Rimmer's had been. Authorities worked extremely hard to identify the culprit behind the killings. They even formed a dedicated task force and offered a 6-figure reward for information leading to the arrest of a suspect, yet they continuously came up empty-handed in their efforts. At the time, the $250,000 payout was the largest reward that had ever been offered in the state, but nobody came forward to share what they knew, suggesting that the public was just as clueless about the serial killer's identity as the authorities were. Because all 3 women were waiting for taxis when they were abducted, law enforcement narrowed their focus on cab drivers. Thousands of cabbies were fingerprinted, and many with serious criminal histories had their licenses revoked. But the massive undertaking brought police no closer to catching the Claremont serial killer. Numerous suspects and persons of interest were cleared throughout the years-long investigation, leading to one dead end after another. Detectives were further baffled by the fact that the killings had suddenly just stopped, which is uncharacteristic of serial killers. It begged the question of whether the perpetrator was still living in the area or if he was even alive. Answers finally came in 2016 when police discovered that the killer was both alive and living locally. Thanks to new evidence, authorities identified the murderer as Bradley Robert Edwards, a Pee-wee sports coach, technician, and married stepdad in his mid-40s who would have probably never crossed investigators' radar if not for his DNA being on record after an attack on a hospital worker decades earlier. In addition to being convicted in 2 of the Claremont killings, Edwards was found guilty of committing numerous attacks on surviving victims before he escalated his crimes to murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years, which means that he'll most likely die behind bars. Number 9. Oido Poras. 76-year-old Luth Poras was found dead at her home in Queens, New York in May of 2023 by her adult son, who immediately called 911 after he discovered his mother's body at the bottom of a staircase. Investigators quickly noticed that the scene appeared staged to look like Luth had died from a fall and that her injuries were consistent with having been bludgeoned. Someone had attempted to mop up blood elsewhere in the home, and the slain senior citizen's husband, 86-year-old Oido Poras, had blood on his face and feet. Poras denied killing his wife and claimed he had been out all day, even though surveillance footage showed that he didn't leave the home. He and Luth fought frequently, according to police, who had been to the residence numerous times in the past in response to domestic incident reports. Luth had filed for divorce just weeks before her violent death. Based on the evidence, authorities are accusing Poras of beating Luth to death on the second floor of their home and then shoving her body down the stairs. Blood was smeared all over the home, and Ovidio's footprints were found in it, even though he claimed to have nothing to do with his wife's murder. He also had no explanation for why he was covered in blood. Prosecutors charged Poras with murder, and he was ordered to Rikers without bail. During the booking process, he allegedly refused to comply with corrections officers and was placed in restraints. He developed a blood clot overnight and was hospitalized in intensive care the next day. His current condition and the status of the case are unclear. Do you think Oido Poras should spend the rest of his life in prison? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 8. Anthony Aello. It was extremely unlike 67-year-old pharmacy technician Wana Bara to miss work without calling in, so when she failed to show up for her shift one day in 2018, her colleagues immediately suspected something was wrong. After failing to reach Karen over the phone, her good friend and co-worker of 27 years, Amber Ashfaq, paid a visit to her San Jose, California home. Ashfaq was horrified to find her friend of nearly 3 decades dead on her kitchen floor, clutching a knife and covered in horrific face, head, and neck injuries, including open skull fractures. Someone had stabbed Karen at least 12 times, and there was a partially eaten slice of pizza near her feet, indicating that her killer had taken her by surprise. Karen's home was in disarray, but nothing valuable seemed to be missing, leading police to suspect that the killer had tried to mislead them by staging the scene to look like a robbery. They also theorized that Karen knew her attacker and had welcomed the person into her home. Investigators questioned the victim's 91-year-old stepfather, Anthony Aello, who told detectives that he had stopped by Karen's house earlier that day to drop off pizza and cookies. He claimed he saw Karen drive past his home later that day with an unidentified passenger in her car. But surveillance footage put Aello at Karen's home at the time of the murder. During that same time period, Karen's Fitbit recorded a sharp spike in her heart rate, followed by a sudden drop and then no activity at all. All signs pointed toward Aello killing his stepdaughter, despite his advanced age. He maintained his innocence but was charged with first-degree murder. Aello's defense attorney, Edward Caden, told Oxygen that he believed there was a third party at the scene who carried out the murder. He said he was disappointed that he wouldn't have the opportunity to prove his client's innocence in court, even though investigators found no evidence of an additional unidentified suspect participating in the crime. The elderly killer's motive for killing his stepdaughter is unclear. Number 7. Tommy Ray Neumann. In April 1974, a young woman named Danita Ann Cash was abducted at gunpoint in Arlington, Texas, while searching for her brother and his friend in a wooded area. The kidnapper forced Danita into his pickup truck, where he covered her mouth with double-sided tape and bound her wrists together with wire. The teen continued to fight back after the man began driving, causing him to lose control of his truck and run off the road. Desperate to survive the ordeal, Danita hoped the abductor was a Christian and showed him a religious necklace she was wearing as she begged him not to kill her. Much to her surprise, it worked. The captor freed Danita's bindings and instructed her to return to her car. He also warned her not to call the police, which is exactly what she did as soon as she arrived home, and told her family what had happened. Danita's description of the suspect's vehicle and the tape he had used helped investigators identify a carpet layer and Sunday school teacher named Tommy Ray Neumann as her abductor. As Neumann prepared to paint his truck outside his Euless home 2 weeks after the kidnapping, police rolled up and arrested him. Neumann had been an active member of his local church since moving to the area 2 years earlier, yet he was a serial killer who spent his spare time murdering innocent people. Danita was incredibly lucky she got away because he killed all his other known victims in cold blood. According to the New York Daily News, civilians and police were both shocked to learn that the man they previously thought of as a model citizen had admitted to killing at least 3 victims. The confessions came after being grilled by police for hours following Danita's abduction. Nealon's first victim was 27-year-old Nancy Mitchell, who had lived next door to him in Kermit, Texas. She was killed in 1970, roughly 4 years before Danita was kidnapped. Nancy's husband returned home from working the night shift to find his wife missing. Authorities let Nealon go after a lie detector test turned up inconclusive. The missing woman's remains were found 9 months later, and the case remained cold until Nealon confessed. After admitting to Nancy's murder, Nealon told investigators that he killed a missing couple from Oklahoma in July 1972. Mary Jane Handy and Robert Golson vanished on their way to a concert in Dallas and were found dead along a highway the following day. Their car had broken down on the roadside, and they had unsuspectingly accepted a ride from Nealon, who told police that he stabbed the pair to death. Nealon later recanted his confessions, claiming he had admitted to his crimes under duress and accusing the police of brutality. But the jury was unswayed, and he was found guilty of 3 counts of murder. He was sentenced to over 500 years in prison, but was paroled in 1987 after serving just 13 years. Number 6. Daniel Jack Kelsall. 31-year-old Australian businessman Morgan Huxley was brutally assaulted and stabbed to death in September 2013 after being followed home from a bar in Sydney. Surveillance footage showed him leaving the establishment barefoot and in what appeared to be a highly intoxicated state. During the investigation, police identified a 20-year-old restaurant worker named Daniel Jack Kelsall as a man who was seen following Huxley in surveillance footage that was captured during his walk home. They brought him in for questioning and immediately noticed that he was a lot smaller than the victim, very young-looking and extremely socially awkward. Kelsall was undeniably strange, but he apparently seemed harmless enough to investigators, who questioned him after he was seen jogging after Huxley in surveillance footage shortly before the murder. It seemed unlikely that Kelsall would have been able to overpower Huxley, and the police believed him when he said he was never inside the victim's apartment. Detectives shifted their focus to other leads, including the multiple women that Huxley was dating at the time of his death, and a recent work-related conflict. 2 days after his initial interview, Kelsall called the police up and admitted that he had been inside Huxley's apartment on the night of the murder. He claimed that they had a consensual encounter and that Huxley was alive and well when he left the building. Kelsall said he noticed an angry-looking blonde woman staring him down as he exited the apartment. He speculated that she became enraged and killed Huxley after realizing the nature of Kelsall's visit to the victim's home. Shortly after making the admission, Kelsall lawyered up and refused to cooperate any further with investigators, who are now highly suspicious that he was the murderer. A look at Kelsall's psychiatric history revealed that he had expressed a compulsive desire to kill a random person for no particular reason about a year before Huxley's murder. Kelsall stuck to his story in court, but the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence that Huxley was strictly interested in women. Even after diving as deep as they could into every corner of Huxley's life, investigators had found no signs that the victim had a secret attraction to men. The conflicting evidence cast major doubt on Kelsall's story about having an intimate encounter with Huxley. The defense painted Kelsall out as meek, innocent, and almost childlike, as if he were incapable of murdering someone in cold blood, while admitting in the same breath that he went over to Huxley's apartment with plans to assault, but not kill the victim. Needless to say, the narrative was unconvincing and the evidence spoke for itself. Kelsall was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Number 5. Melinda Harmon Reich. Midwestern soccer mom Melinda Harmon Reich, also known by her maiden name Lambert, hardly seemed like the killing type. Yet a petite young housewife was the first person police suspected when her husband, 25-year-old David Harmon, was beaten to death inside the couple's Olathe, Kansas home in 1982. Reich appeared at a neighbor's door at 2:30 a.m. in a frantic state on the morning of the murder. She claimed that a pair of black men had knocked her unconscious before killing David, and that she awoke to find her husband dead and the suspects gone from the scene. David was bludgeoned so badly that responding officers initially thought he had been shot in the face at close range. Paul Morrison, who reported to the scene, later told the Oxygen series Snapped that he recalled seeing brain matter splattered against the wall. He described David's face as having been beaten to mush. But investigators didn't buy Melinda's story. They immediately noticed a lack of defensive wounds on David's body, indicating that he was ambushed when he least expected it and was incapable of fighting back against his attackers. The medical examiner who performed his autopsy concluded that he was most likely asleep when he was attacked. An unlikely scenario if a pair of intruders had broken into the home and were beating his wife. Detective suspicions were further heightened after Melinda told them that the intruders had demanded the keys to the bank where her husband worked. Cops were staked out near the bank, waiting for the alleged perpetrators to show up and rob it, but the mystery men never materialized. But law enforcement didn't think Melinda committed the gruesome act on her own. They were quick to cast suspicion on the Harmon's close friend, Mark Mangelsdorf, who spent so much time at the couple's home that people found it a bit strange. Rumors had already begun to swirl about Melinda and Mark having an affair after their friends and neighbors began noticing that the two seemed inappropriately close for two people who claimed to be strictly platonic friends. It was especially controversial in a conservative Christian town where everyone knew each other and infidelity was heavily frowned upon. People were surprised when the relationship between Melinda and Mark suddenly cooled off after the murder, now that they were free to carry on the affair without David in the way. But the two went their separate ways after police failed to find enough evidence to nail them in connection with David's death. Mark became a marketing executive and moved to New York City, while Melinda married a successful dentist in Ohio and raised a family. In 2001, detectives refocused on the cold case. They visited Melinda, who was now in her 40s, and noticed that her story was different from the version of events she had given 20 years earlier. This time, she claimed there was only one intruder. Investigators were quick to call her on her inconsistencies, and she soon pointed the finger at Mangelsdorf while doing what she could to save herself from a lengthy prison sentence. She agreed to testify against Mark in exchange for leniency and was sentenced to just 9 years in prison for her role in the crime. Mangelsdorf ended up pleading guilty to second-degree murder and received a 10 to 20-year sentence. Melinda was paroled in 2015 and is on probation until 2025. Soon she'll no longer be bound by any legal requirements or supervision. Mark was released on parole in 2016. Number 4. Rex Huang. In May 2010, a young escort named Shannon Gilbert vanished during a date in Long Island, New York. She was last seen running from the client's residence late at night while on the phone with a 911 dispatcher, claiming that there were people after her and that they were going to kill her. Shannon's mother pushed relentlessly for law enforcement to investigate the case. While searching for the young woman's body in a marshy area along the shoreline of Gilgo Beach several months later, investigators uncovered the remains of at least 10 people, including Shannon. 4 of the victims, now known as the Gilgo 4, are believed to be the work of a serial killer. The remains, which belonged to 4 escorts who vanished between July 2007 and September 2010, were all wrapped in burlap and discarded in a similar fashion. The first of the Gilgo 4 to go missing was 25-year-old Maureen Brainerd Barnes. 24-year-old Melissa Barthélemy disappeared 2 years later, in July 2009, followed by 22-year-old Megan Waterman, who vanished in June 2010. The 4th victim, 27-year-old Amber Lynn Costello, disappeared 3 months later in September 2010. Authorities do not believe any of the other victims were murdered by the serial killer, including Shannon Gilbert, but the investigation is far from over. Efforts to identify the killer of the Gilgo 4 stalled, and the case continually stalled for more than 13 years following the discovery of the bodies. Answers finally came in July of 2022, after a dedicated task force revisited the murders in painstaking detail and identified an unlikely suspect. Phone records, online activity, eyewitness accounts, and eventually DNA led the team to a towering 59-year-old architect and married father of 2 named Rex Huang. He lived in Massapequa Park, not far from where the women's bodies were dumped, and commuted to Manhattan every day for work. Huang had no criminal record whatsoever. He was awkward and extremely large, with some who knew him even describing him as creepy. But he didn't seem dangerous to most of the people in his life. According to court documents, Huang responded to his victims' escorting ads using several different burner phones. He was extremely stealthy and even managed to hide his double life from his wife, who was out of town when each of the murders occurred. After news of Huang's arrest broke, a former escort named Nikki Brass recognized him as a prospective client she had gone out on a date with sometime between 2014 and 2016. She told reporters that Huang was unhappy that she made him meet in public to establish whether she felt safe continuing the meeting in private. Over dinner, Huang allegedly struck up a conversation about true crime. They talked about several cases, but his demeanor changed when he brought up the Gilgo Beach murders. According to Brass, Huang seemed almost giddy, as if he was reliving an actual memory of dumping the victims' bodies along the shoreline. It was around that point in the conversation that alarm bells began going off in Nikki's head and telling her not to go behind closed doors with Huang. She trusted her gut and turned down his invitation to go back to his house, only to realize years later that the decision to trust her gut most likely saved her life. The accused serial killer is currently being held without bail at the Suffolk County Jail as prosecutors work to build their case against him. In the meantime, law enforcement is still attempting to determine the full extent of his crimes and if there are any more victims. Huang's wife promptly filed for divorce following his arrest and is not a suspect in the crimes her estranged husband faces. Number 3. Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale. As a creature of habit, 66-year-old high school Spanish teacher Noema Graber often visited a park near the school where she worked in Fairfield, Iowa. So when a student named Willard Miller became enraged because he was failing Graber's class and decided to exact revenge in November 2021, he didn't have to look very hard to find her. Accompanied by a classmate named Jeremy Goodale, Miller followed the unsuspecting teacher into a wooded section of the park, where the young men ambushed her and beat her to death with a baseball bat. The teens hid Graber's lifeless body beneath a tarp, then stole her van. Her remains were found the following day after her family reported her missing. Classmates were quick to implicate Willard and Goodale in the murder, and the suspects were equally quick to point the finger at one another as the primary actor in crime. Miller initially denied hitting Graber at all with the bat, while Goodale accused him of being the mastermind of the disturbing plot. Prosecutors claimed that both suspects participated in the fatal beating and that they planned the crime up to 2 weeks in advance. Instead of moving forward with plans to testify against one another, both young men ultimately decided to take a plea deal in order to avoid a trial. They each admitted to one count of first-degree murder and were both sentenced to life in prison. During Goodale's sentencing, the judge shared his opinion that Miller was the major acting force in the murder, but he said the teen wouldn't have been able to commit the crime without Goodale's help. Miller apologized to Graber's family during his sentencing hearing. He admitted that he knew what he planned to do was wrong and that he did it anyway. As the gravity of his actions and the reality of his future behind bars sank in, he grew slightly tearful but remained mostly unemotional. The judge was unmoved by Miller's words. While handing down the sentence, he described the teen as sinister, evil, and brutal. He acknowledged that Miller's young mind was not fully developed when the crime occurred, but saw it as no excuse for doing something that was off the charts in terms of the cruelty and violence involved. Miller has since filed an appeal. Number 2. Matt Baker. In April 2006, Baptist preacher Matt Baker arrived at his Waco, Texas home to find his wife, Kari, dead from what appeared to be a combination of wine coolers and sleeping pills. The news came as a shock to the couple's congregation and community, who thought of the Bakers and their 2 daughters as the picture-perfect American family. Police were quick to rule out foul play, partially due to Kari's history of depression. They were also at a loss to identify anyone who might want to kill her, given her wholesome lifestyle. But the killer was right under their nose, and Kari's family knew it. Unlike most others, they refused to believe Matt's claims that his wife succumbed to a downward spiral that she could no longer bear to live through, and they were unconvinced by his grieving husband act. Authorities began to rethink their position on the case after discovering that Matt was entangled in an affair that had started 2 months before Kari's death. His mistress, Vanessa Bowles, eventually admitted that she knew about the plan to kill Kari, but had not reported it to police because she was afraid of Matt. During her testimony, Bowles claimed that the morally bankrupt preacher had entertained various ideas about how to kill Kari before finally settling on a plan. He had even allegedly done a test run by drugging Kari's milkshake one night. According to Bowles, Kari threw the drink out because it didn't taste right. Bowles further testified that on the day of Kari's death, Matt handcuffed her to their bed under the guise of spicing things up in the bedroom and then smothered her with a pillow. She said Matt called her afterward and acted completely unfazed, despite having just committed a murder. Several other women came forward with allegations of abuse against Baker and testified against him during his trial. Matt Baker maintained his innocence. His attorney accused Bowles of lying, but the jury found her testimony credible and convicted Baker of Kari's murder. The murderous minister has since traded in his Sunday best for a prison uniform, which he'll most likely be wearing for the rest of his life, as he serves a 65-year sentence. Number 1. Philip Snider. 70-year-old Roberta Snider was reported missing in early 2018 after she vanished during a trip to Memphis with her husband, 73-year-old Philip Snider. Philip told a number of bizarre stories about Roberta's disappearance to investigators in Hartville, Ohio, where the couple lived, making him a suspect from day one. First, Philip claimed that his wife had died suddenly from a medical emergency during the drive to Memphis and that her body was taken away by paramedics. He couldn't remember exactly where it happened or give any identifying details about the ambulance that supposedly picked up Roberta's remains. In his next story, Philip told police that he had thrown Roberta's body off an overpass and into the Tennessee River during the drive home from Memphis. A cadaver dog hit on a tub in the Snider's basement, making detectives even more suspicious that Roberta had met with foul play. But without a body, the case began to stall. In an effort to solve it, a detective named Joan Bauer went undercover and befriended Philip at a local restaurant where he was a regular. Bauer gained Philip's trust, and he eventually told her what really happened to Roberta. The morning after an argument, he smashed his wife in the head with a large hammer twice as she slept in her bed. He then placed a plastic bag over Roberta's head and loaded her body into the bed of his pickup truck. After learning he had confessed to an undercover cop, Philip said he dumped Roberta's remains in a dumpster. Assuming he's finally telling the truth, it means the victim's body ended up at a landfill. Roberta's remains have never been found. Philip Snider pleaded guilty to aggravated murder and was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. Given his current age, he probably won't live long enough to see freedom again. Thanks for watching. What's the most shocking example that comes to mind when you think back to a time when someone you thought you knew did something you couldn't believe they were capable of, and not in a good way? Let us know in the comments below, but be sure to subscribe first. See you next time. Bye.